You say you've moved on, but why does the thought of them still make your chest tighten? You claim you've let go, yet you still glance at the door, still wonder if they think of you, still replay the same moments like a prisoner polishing his chains. Why? Because you've confused escape with avoidance. You didn't let go, you just buried what you couldn't face. Letting go isn't forgetting. It's the ruthless act of accepting that what once gave you meaning is gone, and that your pain is now your teacher. Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole by confronting what you've repressed. But that confrontation burns. It tears away the illusion that closure comes from others. You don't miss the person. You miss who you were when they still saw you. And until you face that truth, you'll keep calling your cage freedom. You think you're holding on to a person, but you're really holding on to yourself. Not the self you are now, but the self that existed when they still mattered. When they still looked at you with recognition. When you still felt alive through their eyes. This is the trap. This is the invisible mechanism that keeps you bound. Attachment is not love. It's the ego's last defense against its own death. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." That's exactly what happens when you can't let go. You call it love, you call it nostalgia, you call it just missing them. But it's not fate, and it's not connection. It's your unconscious gripping the bars of its own identity, terrified of what will happen if it releases its hold. The ego's first law is survival, and it will survive through anything, even suffering, especially suffering, because pain provides proof that you still exist. Every time you replay a memory, every time you scroll through old photos or rehearse an argument in your head, you're not remembering them, you're remembering you. The version of you that felt certain, that felt significant, that felt seen. It's not the person you can't release. It's the identity that formed around them. They became the mirror in which your ego could admire itself. Their validation, their attention, even their rejection gave your sense of self something to feed on. When that mirror shatters, the ego doesn't see liberation, it sees annihilation. So it clings, it replays, it resists. That's why you can want to move on and still find yourself caught in emotional quicksand. The conscious mind says, "I'm done." But the unconscious whispers, "If you let go, who are you?" And that whisper wins because it's older, deeper, and more primal than your logic. Attachment, in Jungian terms, is the psyche's way of protecting itself from psychological death. Every bond, even the toxic ones, becomes a thread that ties your identity to the world. Cut too many threads at once, and the ego trembles. It thinks it's unraveling. But this unraveling is not the end. It's the beginning of becoming whole. The ego doesn't know that. It only knows that it's losing control. When you think of them, when you feel that ache in your chest, that's not love returning. That's the ego gasping for breath. It's saying, "Remember me as I was. Don't erase me." That's why closure never comes from another person. Because what you seek isn't their forgiveness or understanding. What you seek is permission to let a version of yourself die. Each time you revisit an old conversation in your mind, you're performing a kind of psychological ritual, not of love, but of continuity. The repetition itself is the ego's heartbeat. The story keeps it alive. That's why people say time heals. But then years later, a song or a scent brings everything rushing back. The ego never truly lets go. It only hides what threatens its coherence. But here's the truth. What you think is dying when you release attachment is only the illusion of who you were. The self that depended on that person was never complete. It was a fragment. Letting go doesn't destroy you. It dismantles the false layers that kept you divided from your true nature. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. The pain you feel when you try to let go is not a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that transformation has begun. You're standing at the threshold where the familiar self ends and the authentic self begins. But the ego fights, claws, and bargains. It doesn't want transformation. It wants safety. It wants repetition. Because repetition, even of suffering, is predictable. And predictability feels like existence. That's why your mind keeps returning to the past. Not because it wants happiness, but because it fears nothingness. The silence that comes after detachment terrifies it. But within that silence lies everything you've been chasing. Peace, clarity, freedom. So when the ache rises, when the mind starts replaying the old movie again, recognize what's really happening. The ego is performing CPR on an identity that has outlived its purpose. Let it struggle, let it grieve, but don't confuse its cries for truth. Because the moment you see this, truly see it, the spell begins to break. You start to realize that the person you thought you couldn't live without was never the anchor. They were the mirror, and mirrors only reflect what's placed before them. Letting go feels like loss because your mind believes it's dying. But in truth, it's not death you're facing. It's rebirth. What if your attachment isn't about love at all, but about control? Not control over them, but over yourself. Over the chaos that would surface if you truly released. Beneath every desperate grip lies a hidden fear that without the thing you're holding on to, there will be nothing left. This is the shadow's secret. It doesn't fear loss. It fears emptiness. The shadow, as Jung described it, is the part of you that hides in the dark. Not because it's evil, but because it's unseen. It's the accumulation of everything you've disowned, denied, or feared to face. And when you can't sit with emptiness, the shadow reaches outward. It attaches, it obsesses, it clings, like a ghost haunting the place it once lived. It keeps revisiting the past, not to find peace, but to confirm it still exists. You think you're remembering someone, but the shadow is trying to prove that you mattered. It whispers, if they still occupy your mind, then you were real. Then you left a mark. That's why letting go feels unbearable, because your sense of worth has been stitched into the presence of another. Without them, the fabric of your identity starts to tear. We hold on to prove that we were significant, that our love meant something, that our pain had purpose. The ego wants survival, but the shadow wants recognition. It wants to be seen, even if the only way it knows how is through suffering. So it turns loss into obsession. It says, if I can't have them, I'll at least keep the wound. Because a wound, unlike emptiness, is tangible. It reminds you that you once felt alive. That's why detachment isn't as simple as deciding to move on. It's an act of confronting the void inside you. The moment you stop chasing, the silence appears. And in that silence, the shadow panics. It has spent years defining itself through pursuit, through wanting, through never being enough. Now, with nothing left to chase, it feels naked. You might notice it in small ways, checking their profile just to see, replaying old texts, revisiting memories that hurt. You tell yourself it's harmless curiosity, but every time you do, the shadow feeds. It feeds on familiarity, on patterns, on the illusion of control. Because in repetition, it doesn't have to face the question that terrifies it most. Who am I without the chase? This is why Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious will rule your life. What you repress doesn't disappear, it finds another form. The shadow behind your attachment isn't just longing for someone, it's longing for the parts of you that were never validated. The tenderness, the vulnerability, the need to be chosen, all of it gets projected onto them. You don't chase them because they're special. You chase them because they carry the reflection of the self you abandoned. What you refuse to see in yourself, you keep chasing in others. That is the law of projection, the invisible gravity of the psyche. Every person you can't let go of reveals a hidden part of you that's begging to return home. That's why even after they're gone, something still pulls you toward them. It's not love. It's the shadow asking to be seen. When you cling, you're not holding on to another person. You're holding on to your own unmet needs. Disguised as devotion, you're gripping the image of what you once hoped you could be through them. And the irony is cruel. The harder you hold, the less you feel. Because attachment is the shadow's way of numbing emptiness by filling it with longing. So when you finally let go, understand what's really happening. You're not losing them. You're meeting the part of yourself you abandoned, the ghost you've been chasing through other people's eyes. And when you can stand in that emptiness without running, something extraordinary happens. The ghost stops haunting. The shadow no longer needs to control because for the first time it has been seen. There comes a moment when the clinging stops. Not because you've mastered detachment, but because you've simply exhausted yourself. The mind runs out of stories to tell. The heart runs out of arguments to make. And what's left is silence. The kind of silence that hums beneath the skin. A silence so vast it feels like death. This is the collapse, the sacred breaking point between attachment and freedom. It's the stage few people understand because it looks nothing like healing. It feels like withdrawal, like the ground giving way, like you've been hollowed out from the inside. You look around and nothing feels real. You no longer recognize the version of yourself that once begged to be seen, yet you haven't fully met the one who will rise after. You're caught in between, the death of the old self and the slow birth of something new. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And this, right here, is the pain he meant. The psyche, in its process of awakening, doesn't expand in comfort. It disintegrates. It tears down the false walls you've built to protect the ego. The identities you clung to, the lover, the savior, the victim, the one who was never enough. They all begin to crumble. You think you're losing yourself, but what's actually dying is the illusion of who you thought you were. When attachment collapses, the ego can no longer hold the center. You feel unmoored, drifting in emotional space. The phone is quiet. The old habits lose meaning. You start noticing the absence of the noise that once defined your days, and in that absence, something terrifying stirs, the awareness of your own emptiness. You may try to escape it at first. You'll reach for distractions, for closure, for someone new to fill the gap, but the psyche won't let you bypass the lesson this time. The silence becomes heavier, insistent. It presses against your chest, forcing you inward, because this is where transformation begins. Not in gaining something new, but in losing what was false. Jung called this dissolution, the psychological death that precedes individuation. Before the self can integrate its shadow, the structures of the false self must dissolve. That means everything that once defined you through others, their love, their rejection, their perception, has to collapse. It's not punishment, it's purification. The psyche is cleansing itself of borrowed identities. You'll feel it in your bones. The ache of letting go, the trembling uncertainty of who you are without the story. The mind will beg for something to hold on to, some fragment of the past to prove you're still real. But the deeper truth is that this emptiness you fear is not the end. It's the clearing where the real you begins to grow. Think of a forest after fire. Everything looks dead, blackened, ruined. But underneath the ash, the soil is richer than before. The roots that survived now have space to breathe, to spread, to create life again. Your collapse works the same way. The burning away of false attachments makes room for authenticity. What you lose in form, you gain in depth. This phase isn't glamorous. It's raw, quiet, and brutally honest. You'll question your progress, your worth, even your sanity. You'll look back on the old world you built around someone else and wonder how you ever thought that was safety. And slowly, as the ashes settle, you'll start to notice faint signs of rebirth. The return of curiosity, the gentle pulse of self-compassion, the whisper of possibility. The ego doesn't die easily. It will fight to rebuild the old patterns. It will tell you that without attachment, life is meaningless. But if you can resist the urge to reconstruct too soon, something remarkable happens. The silence that once terrified you becomes sacred. It stops being emptiness and starts being space. Space to feel, to see, to create, to simply be. That's the paradox of transformation. What feels like destruction is actually integration. The collapse isn't the failure of your psyche. It's its reorganization. The false self breaks so the authentic self can emerge. You're not losing the capacity to love. You're losing the compulsion to cling. And in that loss, love finally becomes real. Not possession, not projection, but presence. So when your world begins to fall apart, remember, it's supposed to. You're watching the old scaffolding of identity crumble under its own weight. Let it. The collapse is not chaos. It's alignment in disguise. That's why when you finally let go, your world first falls apart before it begins to realign. Something subtle begins to happen after the collapse, almost imperceptible at first. The noise inside you quiets. The ache that once screamed now hums like a distant echo. You wake up one morning and realize that the world hasn't changed. Yet somehow, it feels entirely different. The same streets, the same faces, the same routines. But the emotional gravity that used to pull you towards certain people, certain wounds, no longer has the same hold. This is the shift, the silent reorganization of your inner world. Where chaos once felt magnetic, now it feels heavy. The drama that used to lure you feels childish. The people who once mirrored your pain no longer ignite the same spark. It's not that you've become indifferent, it's that your nervous system has recalibrated. Peace starts to replace anxiety, not as a forced mantra, but as a lived frequency. You find comfort in simplicity. You breathe slower. You listen more. Silence, which once felt suffocating, now feels sacred. This is what Jung called individuation, the process by which the unconscious and conscious mind realign into harmony. It's not enlightenment, not perfection, but integration. You're no longer ruled by hidden forces you can't name. The shadow, once your saboteur, now becomes your ally. Its energy, once spent on obsession and control, begins to fuel purpose, creativity, and depth. You stop needing to chase validation because you've become the source of it. It's like shifting from orbiting others' gravity to generating your own. For years, your sense of worth was dependent on someone else's recognition. You lived as a satellite, reflecting light that wasn't yours. But after the collapse, the energy that was once bound in longing begins to turn inward, igniting the center. You start to radiate instead of reach. You stop living reactively and begin responding from awareness. You'll notice how attraction changes. Where you once gravitated toward intensity, the thrill, the uncertainty, the emotional highs and lows, now you crave steadiness. Not because you're bored, but because chaos no longer feels like home. You start to recognize that peace was never dull. It just felt unfamiliar. The nervous system that once mistook turbulence for love now relaxes in calm connection. You find beauty in stillness. Relationships evolve too. The need to prove, to be chosen, to be enough begins to dissolve. You no longer need to extract meaning from others because you've found it within yourself. You start setting boundaries, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You can finally say no without guilt, yes without desperation, and goodbye without collapse. You'll notice how attraction changes. Where you once gravitated toward intensity, the thrill, the uncertainty, the emotional highs and lows, now you crave steadiness. Not because you're bored, but because chaos no longer feels like home. You start to recognize that peace was never dull. It just felt unfamiliar. The nervous system that once mistook turbulence for love now relaxes in calm connection. You find beauty in stillness. Relationships evolve too. The need to prove, to be chosen, to be enough begins to dissolve. You no longer need to extract meaning from others because you've found it within yourself. You start setting boundaries, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You can finally say no without guilt, yes without desperation, and goodbye without collapse. Internally, something fundamental reorganizes. The unconscious that once ruled from the shadows now works in cooperation with your conscious will. Old triggers lose power, old patterns fade, not because you've repressed them, but because they've been seen, understood, and integrated. The same memories still exist, but they no longer define you. They've transformed into wisdom. The ego, once the desperate architect of your identity, becomes a servant instead of a master. It no longer fights to control outcomes. It works with your deeper intelligence. You start to move through life with less resistance. Not because everything goes your way, but because you no longer need it to. You trust your own process. You trust that whatever leaves does so for a reason, and whatever stays serves your growth. This new alignment changes how you perceive reality itself. What once appeared as chaos now reveals its structure. Coincidences begin to feel meaningful. Encounters carry synchronicity. You start seeing patterns not as fate controlling you, but as reflections of your own psyche unfolding. You realize that your external world was never separate. It was a mirror of your internal state all along. The body mirrors the shift too. The constant tightness in your chest begins to release. The fatigue that came from emotional resistance eases. You start sleeping better. Your mind no longer loops endlessly around the same question. Why did this happen? Because you now understand that it had to. Every attachment, every heartbreak, every collapse was a thread leading you here, to wholeness. You begin to feel time differently. The past no longer chains you. The future no longer threatens you. You start living from the present, not as a spiritual idea, but as a felt experience. Every moment feels richer, denser, alive with subtle meaning. Even mundane things, a stranger's smile, the sound of rain, the stillness before dawn, begin to move you. You've stopped searching for intensity, and in doing so, you find depth. This is the reward of integration, the ability to exist fully in your own gravity. You no longer orbit the expectations, emotions, or chaos of others. Instead, you move from a quiet center, grounded, steady, unshakable. Life doesn't become perfect, but it becomes real. And in that reality, peace isn't something you chase, it's something you are. That's the paradox of inner reorganization. Nothing outside you has changed, yet everything feels transformed. The same situations that once broke you now reveal their teaching. The same silence that once terrified you now becomes your sanctuary. You realize that freedom was never about detaching from the world. It was about returning to it, whole and awake. This is the moment Jung described, when the unconscious becomes conscious, when the fragments unite into one living self. You are no longer split between who you show and who you hide. The inner war ends. The need to prove, perform, or perfect dissolves. You stop surviving life and start inhabiting it. And that's when you understand the truth you've been circling all along. Everything changes. Not because the world did, but because you finally returned to it whole. There comes a point when the storm quiets. Not because it's over, but because you've stopped fighting it. You realize the world doesn't need to change for you to be at peace. The ache that once felt unbearable now carries a strange sweetness, as if it's saying thank you. Thank you for letting me go. What was once a wound becomes a window. What was once absence becomes space. This is liberation. Not the loud triumph of moving on, but the silent grace of returning home to yourself. You look around and notice that nothing is missing. The people who left, the stories that ended, the identities that dissolved, they were never meant to stay. They were bridges. They carried you to this exact moment, where the only thing left to find was you. Letting go, you discover, was never about losing. It was about remembering that you were whole before you ever attached. Remembering that peace was not given by another. It was your own reflection, waiting beneath the noise. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That is the essence of liberation. You no longer live through borrowed eyes. You no longer crave mirrors to confirm your worth. You've become the source, the center, the witness. What once felt like emptiness now feels like spaciousness, a vast, open field where new possibilities quietly take root. You start moving differently. You speak softer, but your words carry more truth. You give without fear of depletion because you're no longer pouring from lack. You stop performing, you simply exist, and that existence is enough. The beauty of this freedom is that it doesn't depend on outcomes. Whether love stays or leaves, whether life gives or takes, you remain. You're no longer anchored to external tides. You are the ocean itself. There's gratitude now, not just for the peace, but for the pain that brought it. Every heartbreak, every sleepless night, every desperate grasp was the soul's way of carving space for truth. You see that what broke you was actually shaping you. The collapse was the initiation. The emptiness was the altar. And in surviving it, you didn't just heal, you awakened. Living without the anchor doesn't mean drifting. It means trusting your own current. You stop defining freedom as distance and start understanding it as presence. You can love without attachment, give without fear, lose without collapsing, because nothing essential can ever be taken from you again. The love that remains now is clean, unbound, and rooted in awareness. You begin to feel gratitude for the ones who left, not from pride, but from perspective. They were teachers disguised as lovers, mirrors disguised as wounds. Through them, you learned where you end and the world begins. Through them, you found the courage to meet the self that was waiting in the silence all along. And so, letting go no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like reunion, a return to the truth that you were never incomplete. The old self that needed constant reflection is gone. In its place stands something quiet, grounded and whole. You don't chase alignment anymore. You live from it. You stop seeking signs because you've become one. The distance between who you are and who you were collapses. Life no longer feels like something to conquer. It becomes something to inhabit. When you finally let go, life stops being something you chase. It becomes something you embody. That is liberation, to breathe without resistance, to love without ownership, to exist without needing permission. The peace you once begged the world for now flows from within. It hums softly, steady as a pulse. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply is. So here's your invitation. A small act of ritual closure. Write in the comments what you're ready to release. Let this be your symbolic act of freedom. Name the person, the memory, the old version of you that no longer needs to carry your identity. As you write, feel the thread loosen, feel the breath return, and when you're done, sit in the silence that follows. Not as emptiness, but as arrival. Because this is it. The return, the moment you stop reaching outward and begin standing fully in your own gravity. If this message spoke to you, watch the next video. We'll explore how to stay whole, even when love ends. And this is just the surface. If you want to go deeper, check out my ebook, The Dark Thread We've All Been Tied To. Link in the pinned comments.